it was a great movie, but
Yeah.
it seemed like there was resistance to that movie.
Mel Gibson was on the Joe Rogan podcast talking about the sequel to The Passion of the Christ.
There are moments in a conversation that stop time, not because of a clever joke or a shocking headline, but because someone says something true, something so uncomfortably honest that the air in the room changes. That is exactly what happened when Mel Gibson sat across from Joe Rogan. And if you were not paying close attention, you almost missed why it mattered so much. Joe Rogan has spent years interviewing people who have lived on the edge of something extraordinary. Presidents, combat veterans, scientists, comedians, philosophers. He has sat across from human beings who have stared into the abyss and come back with a story. But when Mel Gibson started talking about the Passion of the Christ, not the press release version, not the Hollywood version, but the real version, Rogan went quiet in a way that told you everything. This was not a man being polite. This was a man genuinely processing something he had not expected to hear. Gibson did not come to that podcast to promote a film. He came as someone who has spent decades living with the weight of a decision that cost him almost everything, and who has never once pretended it did not. That kind of honesty is rare anywhere. In Hollywood, it is almost unheard of. To understand what Gibson revealed, you have to go back to where it began. Gibson began production on The Passion of the Christ without securing outside funding or distribution. In 2002, he explained why he could not get backing from Hollywood studios, saying it was a film about something that nobody wants to touch, shot in 2 dead languages. Think about what that means for a moment. This was a man who had won the Academy Award for Best Director for Braveheart. He was one of the most commercially successful filmmakers and actors on earth. And when he walked into studios with this project, doors closed in his face. Gibson financed the film himself through his production company Icon, putting up an estimated $30 million of his own money after every major studio in Hollywood passed on it. That is not a small act of defiance. That is a man betting his financial future, his professional reputation, and his standing in an industry he had spent decades building, all on a story he believed needed to be told. Most people, faced with that kind of unanimous institutional rejection, would have found a way to convince themselves the idea was wrong. Gibson did the opposite. He doubled down. On the Joe Rogan podcast, Gibson addressed something that rarely gets spoken about directly in interviews. He talked about the particular kind of resistance that surrounds Christian storytelling in modern Hollywood. He told Rogan that his idea for a film based around the crucifixion of Jesus faced serious pushback. There was a lot of opposition to it, he explained. I think if you ever hit on that subject matter, you're going to get people going, because, of course, it's a big subject matter. But Gibson went further than that. He pointed out a pattern that anyone who has worked in entertainment long enough eventually notices, that Christianity occupies a peculiar position in the culture, one where it is simultaneously everywhere and nowhere welcome. Other faith traditions are treated with a kind of cautious reverence. Christianity, particularly its most sacred stories, tends to be met with dismissal or open mockery. Gibson said it plainly, and Rogan did not push back because there was nothing to push back on. It was simply true. What Gibson was really talking about was the hidden economics of storytelling in Hollywood. Studios are not ideologically neutral institutions. They make decisions about which stories deserve to exist, and those decisions shape culture over generations. When an entire industry collectively decides that the most significant story in the history of Western civilization is not commercially viable, that is not a business judgment. That is a statement about values. Gibson understood that, and it made him angrier, not more accommodating. Gibson discussed the challenges he faced in making 2004's Passion, which became the highest-grossing R-rated film in U.S. history, raking in $370.8 million against its $30 million budget. But the money, as staggering as those numbers are, was almost beside the point. What the box office proved was not just that the film was commercially viable. It proved that an entire audience had been ignored and underestimated for years. Millions of people wanted to see this story told with seriousness, with courage, with craft. And the industry had looked at those millions of people and decided their hunger for meaning did not count. Then there is the story of what actually happened during production. And this is where the conversation with Rogan took on a different quality entirely. Making the Passion of the Christ was not merely difficult. For Jim Caviezel, the actor who portrayed Jesus, it became something closer to an ordeal that defied ordinary explanation. During the filming of The Passion of the Christ, Jim Caviezel had to endure accidental lashings, a dislocated shoulder, pneumonia, a lung infection, persistent migraines, and getting struck by lightning. Each of these individually would be a significant story. Together, they begin to feel like something else entirely. The shoulder dislocation happened while Caviezel was physically carrying the cross. According to Caviezel himself, the wooden construction weighed 150 pounds, though it felt like considerably more as the day went on. Later they stick you up on a cross in 25-degree temperatures with 30-knot winds, Caviezel explained. Filming almost naked in such frigid conditions gave him a lung infection and pneumonia. The whipping scenes produced their own trauma. In interviews, Caviezel spoke about being accidentally whipped twice, which left a 14-inch scar on his back. During one of those incidents, the blow was so severe that it knocked the air completely out of his lungs. Caviezel later said that in that moment, despite playing Jesus, he felt anything but holy. The pain was absolute and real, and that reality translated directly onto the screen in ways that no special effect could have manufactured. And then there was the lightning. Caviezel described the event in vivid detail, recalling that during the Sermon on the Mount sequence, he climbed the mountain, clouds had formed, and approximately 5 seconds before the strike he knew what was about to happen. "I was lit up like a Christmas tree," he said. What the extras witnessed was fire coming out from both sides of his head, with illumination surrounding his entire body. Gibson, watching from behind the camera, reportedly looked up and asked what had happened to his actor's hair. 5 minutes after Caviezel was struck, assistant director Jan Michelini walked over to check on him, and was then struck himself. Michelini had already been struck earlier in production when lightning hit his umbrella, causing light burns on his fingertips. The statistical probability of what happened to these men during a single film production is essentially incalculable. The crew did not know how to talk about it. Many of them still don't. The lightning strike on Caviezel ultimately led to 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery, and significant ongoing medication. This is not movie mythology. This is documented medical history attached to a man who agreed to portray the most famous figure in human history and paid for it with his body. There was also a quieter transformation happening behind the camera. Luca Leonello, the Italian actor who played Judas Iscariot, was a professed atheist when he took the role. By the time production wrapped, he had converted to Catholicism. He spent months inhabiting the psychology of history's most famous betrayer, studying the mechanics of guilt and the weight of irreversible choices, and came out the other side a believer. Something in that process changed him at a level that his prior convictions could not hold. What Gibson described to Rogan was not a film set. It was something more like a crucible, a place where the ordinary rules about what can and cannot happen seemed to have been quietly suspended. The people who were there carry that with them. You can see it in the way they talk about it, even decades later. There is a quality of awe in their descriptions that has not faded with time or grown ironic with distance. Gibson told Rogan, "The idea was that we're all responsible for this, that his sacrifice was for all mankind, and that for all our ills and all the things in our fallen nature, it was a redemption." That was the theological core of the entire project. And it is also the thing that made so many people uncomfortable. The film refuses to give any audience the comfort of distance. There is no group of ancient villains onto whom the viewer can project responsibility and walk away clean. Gibson wanted every person in every seat to feel the weight of complicity. That is an extraordinarily demanding thing to ask of a paying audience. It is also the reason the film has not faded into the background of cultural memory the way most religious films do. The critical response when the film released was as divided as any in modern cinema history. Gibson said Roger Ebert, as much as he loved to praise and celebrate good films, also loved to point out their flaws. Yet Ebert gave The Passion of the Christ 4 stars. Serious concerns about anti-Semitic potential were raised by religious scholars before the film was released. Concerns rooted in actual historical memory of how passion narratives had been misused. Gibson consistently maintained that the film's intent was to show humanity's universal responsibility, not to assign collective blame to any single group. That debate has never been fully resolved, and perhaps it should not be. Great art is not required to be comfortable, and it is not disqualified by controversy. Now, more than 2 decades after that first film, Gibson is returning to the story. A sequel was officially in development by February 2023, with the plot focusing on the 3 days between Jesus' death and resurrection, as well as a depiction of events of a cosmic war in heaven, exploring the origin of Satan and his fallen angels, different realms including hell, and ending with the death of Christ's apostles. Gibson has described the project as refusing to be a conventional linear narrative. He said the sequel requires juxtaposing the central event with everything else around it, the future, the past, and other realms, calling it getting a little sci-fi out there. Filming has now wrapped. The Resurrection of the Christ, Part 1 is scheduled to release on May 6, 2027, on Ascension Day, with Part 2 arriving on May 25, 2028. Gibson said the story was brought to the screen exactly as I envisioned it. Each of the 2 films carries a reported budget of approximately $100 million, making this combined $200 million project one of the most expensive ever undertaken, without major studio backing. What everyone missed about the Passion of the Christ was never really hidden. It was right there on the surface the entire time. The film was made by a man who did not ask permission, who was told by the most powerful institutions in his industry that this story did not deserve to exist, and who quietly decided that the people doing the telling had no idea what they were talking about, who put his own money, his own name, and his own body, through the actors he pushed past their limits, into a work of genuine conviction, and who then watched as that work earned more money, reached more people, and provoked more genuine reckoning than virtually anything else produced by Hollywood in the same era. Joe Rogan was moved not because he heard a secret. He was moved because he sat across from someone who meant it. In an industry built on performance, Gibson was not performing. He was confessing. And the difference between those 2 things is the difference between entertainment and art. The difference between something you watch and something that watches you back. The story Gibson told on that podcast was not about box office records or Hollywood politics, or even the supernatural events on set, as extraordinary as all of those things are. It was about what happens when a person refuses to let the world's indifference determine the value of what they believe. That is a story without an expiration date, and that is why it still matters.